Right, the attendees are flooding into the webinar, which is fantastic. And I'm just going to start on time with the introduction. So welcome all for this afternoon's CECAN webinar. I'm chairing this session. I am Karina Elsenbroich. I'm a reader in computational modeling at the Social and Public Health Science Unit in Glasgow, and I'm also a co-investigator on CECAN. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for the Center of the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. It just rolls off the tongue every time I say it. And we have been sort of transforming practice in policy evaluation to make it fit for a complex world, in particular in the areas of food, energy, water, and environmental policy making. For more information, you can go to the CECAN website, where there's a link down here on the slide that you're seeing. Today's webinar is an update of the Medical Research Council framework for developing and evaluating complex interventions. So moving away from the normal nexus application, moving into health applications, which is really exciting. And we are delighted to have Kathryn, Skivington and Laurence Moore presenting this webinar. So Kathryn is a research fellow at the Social and Public Health Science Unit at the University of Glasgow, and she has a background in public health and psychology and has been involved in various evaluations of health service and welfare related interventions. Her research interests are broadly on the social determinants of health and discourses of health inequalities, but she's also interested in methods development, in particular for evaluating complex interventions. And this webinar is one of the outputs of that work. And Laurence is the director of the Social and Public Health Sciences Unit at the University of Glasgow. He is a social geographer by background and has worked on the evaluation of both researcher-led and government-led public health interventions and policies for 30 years. He is the founding director of the Decipher Research Centre in Cardiff and the director of the SPHSU since 2013. And he sits on numerous funding boards for NIHR and MRC. Kathryn and Laurence are going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we have time for a Q&A. Please submit your questions in the question box during the presentation, and we'll select some at the end for the Q&A session. Anything else? Yes, the session will be recorded, so you can, and will be made available on the CECAN website later on. So I hand over to Kathryn now for the presentation. Go.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. So like Karina said, I'm Kathryn Skivington, and I'm going to talk to you now about our framework, which was published last year on developing and evaluating complex interventions. And first of all, I just want to give some background as to where the framework came from and some reasons for the update. And then I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we actually updated there. So going to the history, the framework was first published in 2000 as a guidance really for design and evaluation of complex interventions to improve health. It was funded by the Medical Research Council at the time, and it was largely about providing some guidance on rigorous methods for evaluating the effectiveness of non-pharmacological interventions. And it spoke about complex interventions as those interventions that are made up of various interconnecting parts, and in terms of evaluation, largely focused on randomized controlled trials. It came from a sort of evidence-based medicine framework and way of thinking, with, like I said, the main focus being on randomized controlled trials. In 2006, the framework was again updated, funded by the Medical Research Council, this time called Guidance. It was a much less linear and more flexible approach that was provided as a framework than the 2000 version. And as well as that, also took into account intervention development and also the importance of thinking about implementation early rather than just on evaluation. And it expanded somewhat from trial-based evaluation design to incorporate natural experimental studies as well. So these two documents, I'd say, largely came from a particular research paradigm, from an evidence-based medicine school of thought, and kind of conforming to the standard or traditional evidence hierarchy. focused on positivist methodologies. And as such, we wanted to update the framework to reflect the various methodological and theoretical developments since the 2006 guidance was written. So a team of us got together. Some of the authors on our current version were authors on the previous version as well. And this document was published last year. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what I'm talking about with intervention. So here I'm talking about an action or program that aims to bring about identifiable outcomes or any sort of change. So our definition is pretty broad, although we focus here on things that have some impact on health. So like I said, the initial 2 documents were funded by the Medical Research Council, and the third one, our one, was funded both by the Medical Research Council and the National Institute of Health Research. So we're interested in everything from medical treatments, for example, a surgical intervention, to changes in policy. It could be something developed and implemented by the research team, or it could be something beyond the researcher's control. So for example, it might be a change in welfare policy, which has the possibility to impact on health. So these are the various reasons that we updated the complex intervention framework. I'm going to structure the talk around these 5 things, so I won't read them out in detail, but just again to highlight that it was really about the kind of theoretical and methodological developments over the past decade or so. And in addition to that, I guess another kind of driver for spending the time and resource on doing this is that it's a fairly well-used document. So this is just providing some information on citations from this is actually it says 2008 guidance because the guidance was published in 2006, but there was an accompanying BMJ paper in 2008. And you can see that it's been highly cited over the years. I think the last time I checked, there were over 10,000 citations of the BMJ paper in 2008, and it's continuing to increase across the years. And there's some discussion amongst funding boards that it is often cited within funding applications. So clearly people are at least citing the document. So we wanted to update it and hope that people would move on in the way that they were developing and evaluating interventions. So how did we go about the update? We did various scoping reviews based on the gaps that we already knew existed. We also searched for literature that was critical of the previous guidance. We then put together some discussion groups at an expert workshop, which we held in London. I think there was around 40 experts at that workshop pre-pandemic. Where we talked about these things in detail. And then that led to the first draft of the update, which we then put out for open consultation and advertised on various networks and online, etc. We received, I think it was over 50 fairly detailed responses to our consultation, and that really informed the second draft of the document. There was various rounds of peer review, both with the NIHR Journals Library and BMJ, and all of this was overseen by a scientific advisory group. So just to go into some detail on the things that we updated in relation to the reasons for the update. So we wanted to really update the definition of complex interventions, highlighting the relationship between the intervention and its context. So again, just some background on where we're coming from here with this definition of complex intervention. So this is the definition taken from the 2006 document. The dimensions of complexity were really about the intervention itself. So the number of components and the interaction between components and the intervention, the difficulty of behaviours that's required by those delivering or receiving an intervention, the organisational levels that are targeted by the intervention, the variability of outcomes, and the sort of flexibility or tailoring of the intervention permitted. These are all largely about the intervention itself, perhaps with some exception on the final one. But it doesn't. This definition doesn't really take much account of context or how an intervention can be complex beyond the kind of features of the intervention itself. So our updated framework states that complexity arises through those things on the previous slide, the intervention itself, but also the interactions between the intervention and its context. So when I'm talking about context, I'm talking about any feature of circumstances in which an intervention is conceived, developed, evaluated, and implemented. It could be the political context, social context, economic context, etc. And as I'm sure many of you who are have kept up with CECAN's work and who are interested in this area are already well versed in the ideas around complexity and around the intervention being highly context dependent, and also about context being dynamic and multidimensional. I just want to give an example of this lucky iron fish, the picture on the right there. So the lucky iron fish is a small iron ingot, and it's placed in cooking pots as a way of preventing dietary anemia. So a bit of the iron from the fish leaches out into the cooking water, and the aim is that it can reduce iron deficiency. So under the previous definition of complex interventions that was kind of our starting point, if you like, this intervention would come across as really fairly simple. It's got no moving parts. It doesn't seem to require complex behaviours. But if you actually think about the whole process of manufacturing and supplying the fish, encouraging people to use them, plus local contextual factors that might interact with how the intervention works, it in fact becomes very complex. So this is a very, very simple logic model that shows the problem, endemic iron deficiency, the intervention, the output and the outcome of reduced anemia. So it was originally designed for rural Cambodians where the fish could be produced and sourced locally. And the fish shape was actually used to increase uptake, as fish were considered lucky in some Cambodian villages. So there are various things that are likely to lead to the effectiveness of this intervention. And although some trials have shown that the fish has been effective for reducing dietary iron deficiency, other trials have shown no effect. And this has later been found to be because anemia in these regions is largely due to genetic hemoglobin disorder rather than dietary iron deficiency. So it didn't necessarily take account of the causes of anemia. And there's obviously other contextual factors that might be important in determining effectiveness. For example, the capacity to manufacture the fish locally and cheaply, cultural meanings of fish, household cooking and storage practices, and obviously this one here about the causes of anemia. Okay, so that was one thing that we really wanted to bring to the fore in the new framework. The second one was around shifting the usefulness of evidence as the basis for determining the research perspective and questions. So again, I'm just going to go back to our starting point, which was these existing documents. So the 2000 framework arose through a translation of the types of framework that were used to guide drug development research. And it was really adapted to be fit for evaluating more complex interventions in public health and healthcare. However, it definitely remained within a paradigm of where the cardinal question was really about, does this intervention work? It was focused on unbiased estimates of effect. So you can see that the phases along the top are fairly rigid, and the fourth phase is definitive randomized controlled trial with little kind of room for maneuver out of this effectiveness lens. The 2006 guidance took that forward a little bit. It was much less of a linear framework, and it moved from, like I said before, from researcher developed interventions, but to consider the sort of research process more broadly. Within the evaluation phase, it talked about understanding the change process as well as assessing effectiveness. However, largely the focus was primarily, if you like, as the priority for evaluation was still heavily based on assessing effectiveness. So we know that many of the most promising interventions either don't get or can't be evaluated in this way. So if you think about service and policy innovation and population level policies, it's really difficult to do randomized controlled trials of them, and in many cases it's not entirely appropriate. So even if a randomized controlled trial is possible and shows an effect, that that's not necessarily always replicated when the intervention is rolled out for various reasons. For example, the intervention is not in fact implementable or encounters implementation failure. So that would be a lack of focus on implementation from the beginning. It might not be transferable across contexts, and it might be that wider system effects emerge. So if shown to be effective in the short term and then implemented, the effects might be either washed away or at least diluted by system change. And this is particularly evident in interventions that are targeting so-called wicked issues, for example, obesity, where the system of influence is absolutely huge, and where a small change to one aspect of it is very unlikely to make all that much of a difference in the long run. So I think we were kind of wanting to address the fact that insufficient attention is paid to what happens after an intervention has been evaluated as well, and the fact that resources and investment are not necessarily optimized, which has led to research waste, or a production line, if you like, of researcher-led effective interventions that are limited in terms of implementation requirements and stakeholder insight and don't generally work. Doug Altman, who advocated for change in methods and reporting and was a leading figure in these areas, had stated that we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And we wanted to produce a document that would support this in some small way. So we emphasised in our document the use of diverse research perspectives. So we have detailed 4 different perspectives that we think researchers and others working in this area could potentially consider to develop and evaluate and implement their interventions. A key point about this is that it's a really flexible framework. It's flexible to research needs and takes a pluralist approach. So but we're not saying that you have to choose one perspective and not combine it with another, or even necessarily that you need to do one and then stop. So for example, an efficacy perspective is about looking at whether the intervention works in a tightly controlled experimental setting. That's kind of like the first step in an evaluation. So we're aiming to encourage wider awareness, understanding, and use of research that gives sufficient and appropriate consideration to different sources of complexities. So what we're saying is that these perspectives can be overlapping rather than mutually exclusive, but what's particularly important is that the choice of perspective should be governed by the research questions that we want to answer. And although we've not explicitly discussed epistemology, we have challenged the view that unbiased estimates of effectiveness are the sole cardinal goal of evaluation. And we take a very pragmatic approach whereby we encourage researchers to take the most appropriate approach to generate new knowledge to the problem being targeted, and particularly thinking about where it'll be most useful. So I'm just going to run through these very briefly. Like I said, the efficacy perspective is kind of testing an intervention within an ideal situation, aiming for high internal validity and really largely controlling for contextual variation. So an example is testing whether an intervention can work in an ideal setting. So for example, if we have nurse practitioners delivering a behavioural intervention, an efficacy perspective might test that by using highly trained nurse practitioners who have volunteered for the role to deliver the behavioural intervention to individuals who've identified themselves as being very motivated to engage. So it's kind of testing whether it can work in this ideal situation. And if effectiveness perspective is very similar to an efficacy perspective in that it's about testing causal hypotheses about the outcomes that are generated by the intervention. But here it's about testing that in the settings in which the intervention will be delivered in practice. So if we carry on that example from the efficacy perspective, this might be taking the behavioural intervention delivered by nurse practitioners in, for example, a random sample of primary care centres in one area to patients who are referred by the GP rather than necessarily patients who are volunteering themselves as very motivated to engage. So like I said, this perspective is still about average estimates of effects, although there is a little bit more flexibility in terms of intervention delivery. The next perspective is a theory-based perspective, and there's various theory-based evaluation approaches coming from different disciplines, for example, social sciences, health sciences, international development, and we've tried to draw on these, as many of these as possible. The theory-driven approaches are really about exploring complexity, but they're still underpinned by causation. They want to understand why things work the way they do. So causation is certainly still at the heart of many of these approaches. What I think is fairly consistent through a lot of the theory-based approaches is the attention to program theory. So exploring the causal connections between activities and outcomes and theorizing these links and trying to explain them. So program theory is just that. It describes how an intervention is expected to lead to its effects and under what conditions. There's various different terms related to program theory or used for program theory that can be a little bit confusing, sometimes called theory of change. Sometimes it's mixed up with logic models as well. We chose to go with program theory, and this is the definition that we used. And like I said before, there's different theory-based evaluation approaches. So there's theory of change evaluation, realist evaluation, process evaluation, etc. There are many. There is also some debate about whether these different approaches to theory-based evaluation are in fact compatible with other perspectives. For example, there's various debates on whether realist methods can be combined with randomized controlled trials, and there's two fairly separate schools of thought on that, and similarly with systems and realist approaches too, I think. So just moving on now to our fourth perspective that we identified, which was a systems perspective. So again, I think many of the audience here are probably fairly well versed in what a system is, but just in case not, a system is a set of things, for example, cells, people, organizations, excuse me, that are interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And we can theorize interventions as events in systems. This is something that I think Penny Hall wrote about in the 2000s, at some point in the 2000s, so a long time ago. Systems thinking can help us to understand the interaction between an intervention and the context in which it is implemented in a dynamic way. So it really encourages us to think more about the bigger picture. So how interventions can impact on different parts of the system in which they are implemented. And sometimes that is going to be in unexpected ways. Related to that, the outcomes that emerge from the interaction of the parts of a system in ways that can't necessarily be predicted from the properties of the individual parts. So to put it simply, a system can't be understood by breaking it down into its individual entities and then studying each part separately because they are so interconnected. There are various system level properties. These are some examples of them. And they usually help explain why we can't think of complex interventions as discrete entities. So like I said, systems in which interventions are implemented constitute lots of different kinds of parts, not necessarily just individuals, but individuals interacting in various different ways with organizations, institutions, and networks, environments, etc. I'll just give one example of adaptation. So this is how the system responds to change. So does an intervention or event prompt people to do things differently, and does that lead to other changes in the system? An example is the ban on multi-buy offers of alcohol in Scotland. So this was 5 or so years ago. Retailer, probably longer than that actually, not entirely sure, but a while ago, before minimum unit pricing anyway. So retailers were shown to adapt to the policy change on multi-buy offers in Scotland on alcohol by offering much more promotions on individual items. So for example, rather than having 3 bottles of wine for £10, the prices were reduced on the individual bottles. And like I said, that was before minimum unit pricing. And I think that further highlights the need for thinking about a combination of policy approaches to come together in a strategy that take account of the whole system. So there's lots of talk about systems, as Harry Rutter and colleagues wrote about in The Lancet in 2017. They stated that there was a lot of rhetoric around complex systems approaches, but it's only rarely operationalized in ways that generate relevant evidence or effective policies, particularly in relation to public health here. So when we set about this task, we were looking for kind of good examples of this. And although we found a few, I'd say this was the bit that we found it a bit tricky to find some sort of really good examples to draw on. But it was clear that approaching interventions with systems perspective can encourage researchers and others to develop questions that take into account the wider contextual factors that might influence an intervention, and can encourage all the various stakeholders to develop, evaluate and implement whole systems interventions. So we were really wanting to acknowledge complexity and encourage others to acknowledge it as well, without necessarily meaning that research has to explore all aspects of it. We stated that taking a systems perspective can change the focus of interventions from targeting individuals with interventions to bring about behaviour change, as is fairly common in the fields that we are focusing on, to much more upstream action to create the conditions, context, relationships, etc., that support behaviour change, and not only encouraging researchers to propose these sorts of interventions, but crucially encouraging funders to support them as well and fund this kind of thing. And moving from one-off interventions to systematic, sustained change within, for example, schools, workplaces, policy and culture. Also moving the focus of evaluation from thinking about whether it is effective to whether it contributes. So thinking about from what works to what contributes to the system in a positive way, and moving from attribution to contribution. And thinking about contribution could take a systems-based approach or a theory-based approach, or it could possibly even tailor traditional effectiveness approaches to useful evidence for this, I would argue in combination with other approaches. We really wanted to highlight the important questions, like how will the research make a difference, who will use it and who will benefit from it. So just to conclude on that section, we have these 4 research perspectives, and we highlighted the importance of considering the sources of complexity surrounding the intervention before deciding on the research perspective. The development of research questions can be supported by this consideration and awareness of complexity alongside information about what is already known, what is the most important thing to find out, and what the priorities are for key stakeholders. And like I already said, we're talking about a pluralistic approach with potentially overlapping research perspectives if appropriate. So we were saying that complexity-informed research can encourage researchers to develop research questions that take into account the wider contextual factors that influence or are influenced by an intervention over time, but also can encourage the various stakeholders, not only researchers, but funders, practitioners and policymakers to develop, evaluate and implement interventions using the most appropriate tools and methods. The final two reasons that we wanted to update the framework, reasons for updating the framework, were to give attention to intervention adaptation and to interventions developed outside of research teams. So like I said before, it was previously largely about researcher developed interventions. And we also wanted to highlight the various important aspects of complex intervention research that are not always necessarily given due focus. So this was our framework, which we came up with, which looks a little bit like the previous one, but is much less linear in that the arrows are going in and out of this central box rather than from one kind of phase to the next. In terms of giving attention to intervention adaptation and interventions developed outside of research teams, we've added this box on the left here about identifying an intervention. So this is about choosing an intervention that already exists or is planned either via policy or practice and explore its options for evaluation. And we've specifically written about evaluability assessment as a method for exploring these options. And if you're interested in evaluability assessment as a kind of structured method of doing this, we've got lots of links in our NIHR document to that. We also wanted to highlight some aspects of the research that are not always given due focus, and we've put these in the middle and we've called them the core elements. So we suggest that these core elements are identified at the very start and discussed and considered before moving between any of these blue boxes. So I talked a bit about context and programme theory. Engaging stakeholders is relevant to both of those things, as well as to identifying the key uncertainties. In terms of intervention refinement, we want the intervention to be the most implementable. So this is about considering where it is possible to refine the intervention within the bounds of the evaluation that you're undertaking. And then lastly, we wanted to highlight the importance of economic considerations, not just in terms of an economic evaluation, but taking account of economic considerations at a very, very early stage. So we've involved some health economists in the update, and they were also authors on our framework document. So that is a very brief overview of a fairly large document that's published in the NIHR, or the BMJ references here for a shorter version of it. It's got various links out to other documents and case studies, if you're interested in reading more detail on that. I'm going to pass on to Laurence now, who's going to talk a little bit about or reflect on the practical application of the framework. So I'll just stop my share.
Thanks, Kathryn. Yeah, so just to pick up on what Kathryn's saying, one of the things we did discuss explicitly when we had the expert workshop fairly on in the process was really thinking about this update of the guidance, this new framework as an intervention itself. And we kind of thought about what are the changes we're hoping that the update will help to bring about. And certainly very strongly on the agenda was to try and break the kind of the dominance of the paradigm of effectiveness, and thinking that pretty much all evaluation research that we do as health researchers, and pretty much the only research you can get funded by the NIHR, for example, is something, either a trial or something very approximate to a trial that gives you an unbiased estimate of effect. So this is the direction we did want to go, and we wanted to produce a document that helped bring in more pluralistic approaches. But a challenge with that is then sort of how do you do that in a prescriptive way, which of course you can't. So really the document is really aimed to help people deliberate about what they're doing, what their key uncertainties are, what the priority research questions are at each stage of the research process, that will then help to produce information that's most useful to decision makers. So we wanted to do that, and of course part of that means bringing in different kind of paradigms and ways of thinking, such as the theory-based perspective and the systems perspective. And we're really sort of pleased. One of the online comments we had for the BMJ article came from Ray Pawson, one of the godfathers of realism, realist evaluation, and he said that our document was an almighty methodological shove in favour of pluralism in the evaluation of intervention. So we were pleased about that. I mean, Ray had some criticisms, of course, of what we had proposed, but it was nice to see him recognising that, because that was one of the things we wanted to achieve. But the reason we have this picture here is because we were also really anxious to not be too revolutionary. We wanted to take the field with us. We wanted to take the funders with us. So we didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And whilst many of us would advocate that there needs to be greater investment in more theory-based and systems-informed evaluations, and more evaluations of interventions that aren't just targeted at individuals, but are whole systems interventions. We still need to preserve space and protect the fact that for many research questions that remain critically important in health research, particularly evaluative research in health, for many of those research questions, the most important thing to do is to answer a fairly specific question around efficacy and effectiveness. So we didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is why we've introduced this deliberative process and this idea of there being a range of legitimate perspectives for different types of research questions. And so Kathryn has talked about this diagram. I just want to focus a little bit more on these kind of core elements, because in a sense, this is what we're encouraging people to do at all stages of the research process, is think about these core elements, all of which speak to the underlying factors and motivations and needs for updating the guidance that Kathryn has spoken about. And as Kathryn has said, not necessarily moving automatically from one phase to the next, but actually at all stages continuing to think about these, to revise your research questions, to think about, should we be taking a slightly different perspective here, should we be refining the intervention, etc., etc. And also, should we stop? Maybe on this diagram we should have a big arrow here saying, actually, often you can consider these core elements and realize you just need to stop and give up and move on to another intervention. So just focusing on these in a little bit more detail, as you can see, and as Kathryn just mentioned, these all relate to different core elements that we need to think about, that we think are key ways of facilitating this more deliberative approach, this break away from just thinking about researcher-led appetite for identifying, does this intervention work, to actually bringing in the stakeholder and the contextual perspectives, thinking about how the intervention can be refined into what you're identifying as you go along through the research process, and continually considering context and revising the program theory to reshape the intervention potentially, or just to kind of further refine the evaluation questions that you're addressing to find out how and whether this intervention will work in the real world. And we also highlighted the importance of economic considerations, both the value for money of doing the research, but also highlighting the importance of thinking about cost effectiveness throughout any kind of evaluation process. Another thing we thought was really important, and the funders were very keen for us to do, was to try and provide some help for researchers when they're using the tool, but also for funders and reviewers, because what we continually see is papers published saying, we've used the MRC guidance, and they cite the MRC guidance, but then there's very little evidence that they actually have read the guidance and used it in the work they've done. So we wanted some kind of tools that would support that, both for funders, both for researchers when doing research, and then also for editors and publishers in deciding whether the research merited publication or what appropriate caveats needed to be included. So we've included in the NIHR document this checklist for developing evaluation in complex interventions. And as I've said, we've got that for various reasons, to help researchers with the use of the framework, to help funders and peer reviewers in looking at the plans for a particular project, but then also to assess the quality of the work that's being done. And I think also using this tool, I think also helps evidence users to understand the research that's been done and what the implications might be for their own kind of particular decision that they want to make. And I'm just going to briefly talk about that checklist using an example of a study that I was actually involved in doing a long time ago. I won't dwell on that, and I won't sort of talk about that specific study greatly as I go through the slides in the time remaining, but you can all get copies of the slides, and you can, that might help you sort of see how this checklist can be applied to a specific kind of research project. So in the checklist, we firstly look at the core consideration of addressing uncertainty, and we really sort of we're sort of really encouraging the research teams to think about, have you really thought about what the intervention is trying to achieve? And have you identified the key uncertainties about the intervention and the context in which it will be tested or implemented? So really getting them to think about those key uncertainties relating to the intervention. And I've begun to populate this in terms of assist, but I won't really talk through that. I mean, one thing I will mention on this slide is that with assist, it went through a whole series of stages. It went through a development stage where the uncertainties and the focus of the research done was on acceptability and feasibility. It then went through to a trial stage, where the focus was really on, does it work, and getting an unbiased estimate of effect. And then it went through an implementation stage where the uncertainties were different again, and the real focus was on how can we scale up and support its wider scale dissemination. So for any one kind of project, our diagram supports the idea that at different stages of the research process, there will be different uncertainties and therefore different kind of perspectives and different research questions relevant at different stages, and to work through that and continue to think about what do we need to know now, and what's the questions and methods we need to use to help with those what the uncertainties are at this stage. So again, in the checklist, really sort of try and pushing people to think about what are the critical things you need to know now, and what's the appropriate research perspective and the key research questions you need to take to address the uncertainties that are the key ones to address now. And then assist, different methods were used, and it went through an efficacy stage to an effectiveness stage. There was always a theory-based component. This was something we called a realist trial. And then in wider implementation, we looked at a lot of the systems kind of perspectives as well, in terms of spillover and impacts across the school, and the dependence of the intervention on the changing political policy and behavioural context. Engaging stakeholders, this is massively important. I think this is a really major tool to move health researchers away from the current orthodoxy to really think more about real world implementation and system fit and system dependence. So we have got these three key questions in the checklist around stakeholder involvement. We also, again, have some specific questions about really thinking about all the different dimensions of context that may influence how the intervention achieves its effects, and how that there might be particular contextual factors relating to scaling up or scaling out the intervention beyond the initial kind of research and evaluation phase. We also highlight the importance throughout at every stage of the research process. Is there data that you're collecting that's then suggesting you need to refine the program theory, and then that might then lead to bringing some additional research questions, or, as I say, updating the program theory so that evidence users can understand more what's going on and how and where the intervention might work. This might then lead to refining the intervention. We have to get away when you've got a trial orthodoxy. It tends to be once you've defined what the intervention is, you can't change it, because you've got to do a randomized trial comparing the intervention in one fixed form versus some other control type intervention. But again, demonstrating and trying to encourage researchers to continue to think about what's the data telling me about my intervention, and how might I need to refine it and tweak it a little bit so that it's more likely to work in general, or certainly more likely to work in a specific kind of context. And that also obviously being informed by how the program theory is being developed and changed. And then finally, we've got some specific questions about economic factors, both the value for money of the research itself. Is this research worth doing? Are evidence users really interested in this question? And then really think about how we can incorporate in all stages of the evaluation different elements to collect data on costs and benefits, and so we can produce cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness type evidence from our research. And then finally, in our checklist, we also have some questions for people to consider for each of the phases. So I won't talk about those in detail, but I think I did want to talk about the checklist tools. I think this is a useful way of really supporting people in using the framework, and, as I say, also for reviewers to assess how well researchers have actually thought about some of the things that we've said in the framework are so important to think about, albeit you've got nothing in the framework that tells you what the right answer is for any particular situation, because there's so many infinitely different situations that researchers actually come across. But really, we hope that the framework will help people deliberate and therefore optimise their research at each stage, and as Kathryn has said, to reduce research waste. So that's us finished now speaking. We did want to acknowledge the co-authors of the framework, key colleagues who supported us in producing it, and of course all the people who participated in the different consultations, etc. And then we'll obviously hand over to Karina to chair the Q&A session. But we are quite interested, as Kathryn said, we found it quite difficult to identify some really nice examples of where taking a systems perspective has been really useful in an evaluation, and demonstrably so for decision makers. So if you've got any examples like that, they don't have to be from a health context. That would be great if they were, but it would be really great to hear from you if you've got examples of that. I'll stop my share.
Great, thank you very much, Kathryn and Laurence. That was really exciting, and I've learned a lot about health evaluations now, which is super. I can't see any questions right now in the chat. Please, people, if you have questions, just put them in there. Otherwise, I'm just going to abuse my power as chair of the session and ask my own questions. Oh, there's a question. Oh no, it's just a thank you. That's fine. I can ask questions. So now they're coming questions. So we have a question from Sana. What do you think about frameworks like payback, etc., in relation to what you have proposed here? Well,
I'm not sure. I've not come across payback, so I don't know if you have.
Yeah, me neither. We might have to.
I mean, one of the things we are aware of, there's all sorts of frameworks, and I think one of the things we try when we think about what we talk about today is telling you about our journey and our context. So our context was health research, and the slide that Kathryn showed about the number of citations the framework has had in the past. These frameworks are impactful. Maybe there's lots of different ones, and they're targeted to different audiences within our world. The MRC guidance is really very authoritative, or has been in the past, and we hope our update of it will continue to be authoritative and therefore have an effect of getting people thinking more about systems and contexts and different perspectives and different ways of evaluating things beyond effectiveness trials. So, but we are aware that there's some skepticism about how impactful these frameworks are. And particularly that's why the checklist, we introduced that, because that in a sense is hopefully going to help people evidence that they have actually not just cited with the framework, but they have read it and used it and thought about it, and that they can evidence that. So that's one way of actually saying whether it is having an impact.
That is really interesting. We have another interesting question from Tamle Munslow. Do you draw distinctions between theory-based and systems, or can you talk about how the two work together in an evaluation? I think that's a really interesting question because they are often quite connected. So why do you draw a distinction between them? And
I think, yeah, the distinction that we draw is really about the systems perspective, being thinking about the bigger picture of the intervention and where it is placed within a system, whereas the theory-based perspective is more about the intervention itself. So I would say the starting point is the intervention, whereas with the systems perspective, the starting point is the bigger picture. I think that they can usefully be used in tandem in an evaluation, and particularly when we're talking about identifying the most useful questions and drawing on soft systems methodologies, so largely kind of qualitative participatory processes, I think can be really compatible with theory-based approaches, and possibly something that is already being done fairly regularly now. In terms of the systems methodologies for evaluation, I am less able to answer on how compatible that is with theory-based approaches. I don't know if either of you actually have any thoughts on that.
And I think that's fair enough, throwing this back at the complexity in the evaluation community. So, well, I think the other question from Sana is probably, I think Laurence answered that more or less in terms of whether there are other frameworks and whether these frameworks can be used in tandem. So I'm not going to ask that again. I can't see.
I think it might be, if I can come in, Karina, and I think one of the, because I think some people look to our framework, but it'll tell them what to do down to quite a detailed level. And that's what we've not been out with. The framework is so broad now that really we're just trying to encourage people to think about the uncertainties, the perspective, the priority research questions at any particular stage. You know, what is important to know and for whom, and trying to get more focus on things that are important to know for decision makers. So we've got an awful lot of links in the NIHR version to other guidance documents which are about very specific, you know, how to do sample size calculations, or how to do, particularly in terms of case study analysis or process evaluation, these kind of things. And how we see this framework developing in the future, we've actually got some meetings coming up soon, is that it's almost like a meta framework, a meta guidance thing that will increasingly be populated by links to other complementary guidance, which focuses more specifically on specific methods and how you optimally apply specific methods. But this is very much trying to guide people through conceptualizing and planning their evaluation at different stages.
Great, we have another question from Des Brown. What challenges, if any, do you find in identifying possible intervention shortcomings in regards to boundary making, voices heard, not heard, and power, etc.?
Well, I think, some of that question relates a little bit to where you draw the line between what's traditionally been covered by a theory-based approach and a systems-based approach. And so I think that's one of the things we ask people to think about, I suppose, is do develop your program theory, or sometimes we recognize that one way of doing that might be doing some kind of system mapping type exercise. And then really what you've then got to do is, what are the key things I need to focus on? And so part of that question is, how do I bound the system to make my research tractable? And it might be, for some people, they can say, well, really, I need to know a lot about that bit. I need to know a lot about whether that particular very specific mechanism that an intervention is implementing is making a difference. And that might be where you might still say, well, actually doing some kind of efficacy type thing might be worth doing. So you're really shining your spotlight on a very small part of the system that you're aware of for that question. But then, of course, another question might be much more, if we do this, how will the system respond to it? And then your spotlight is then much broader. But that's one of the things. And then we can't tell you where to draw the boundary and what to focus on. But what we're trying to do here is get people to think about, there are different ways of drawing the boundary, both in terms of how I've described it. I think the particular thing about systems approach is, of course, it's dynamic, and it brings in much longer time periods and looking to see what might over time after an intervention is implemented in the system. So again, that's another way of thinking about different ways of bounding what you focus on in your evaluation.
Great. The next question is from Sonia Marjanovic, and it's very similar to a question that I wanted to ask, actually. So what experience have you had with policymakers' preferences for specific types of frameworks or approaches, and how you build shared understandings of their respective values with end users? Has there been a change in views on hierarchies of evidence? And she says, thanks for a great session. So I can second that. So my question was also about what are the hurdles to the change of practice? Is it commissioners, policymakers, which stakeholders? Is it researchers? So this is the same kind of area of question.
I don't think I have any recent experience of doing that, so Laurence can maybe follow up. But I think where we've highlighted evaluability assessment is probably a good starting point for that. So that is a kind of structured method for developing research questions and evaluations. And I think it's a really good way of getting people on board with different perspectives and potentially even again drawing in on these soft systems methods within an evaluability assessment process.
Yeah, my reflection is that there has been a lot of appetite and interest in engaging with much more multi-perspective and systems informed types of ways of thinking about problems. So I think that's the direction of travel, but nevertheless, that currently is still complemented or tensioned against, clearly a real appetite for like a hard nugget of evidence. It's much easier to have a hard nugget of evidence, like a silver bullet type thing, if it's a very specific answer to a specific question. But there's obviously a lot more understanding that actually most of the key issues now are not simple answers, are not simple questions, and therefore, a simple answer to a complex question is probably the wrong answer. And I think there's more understanding of that. So we get a lot of engagement in the different projects we're doing. Some are kind of specific projects, and some of them are much more big kind of consortia. Some of us involved in trying to work with city regions and governments on taking forward some of this ways of working. And there is a real appetite, and particularly a real understanding of the importance of getting multiple perspectives involved and doing research that is useful for decision makers rather than useful for developing causal evidence. But there is that tension, because it does just make it much more complex. And of course, the big thing with decision makers, I always want an answer quickly, and that's often one of the big break points in doing a system mapping long-term type program of work, because they're really interested, and then when they realise it's going to take years rather than weeks, they kind of lose a bit of interest.
And the next question connects very nicely to what you just said about the different perspectives and the importance and willingness to actually take them into account. And this is with regard to the participation of stakeholders. Should they have a direct role in the components of the intervention, or is it sufficient to take their point of view in general? That's from Mosfer Alvala.
I think this is really tricky, the involvement of stakeholders, and could possibly do with some more guidance on it, because it really depends on the intervention and the problem that you're addressing, in terms of the involvement and participation of stakeholders, and the type of stakeholders that you have, and whether they have conflicts of interests, for example. I think the NIHR provides some reasonably good information on the role that stakeholders should have in designing interventions within the kind of health service fields, and it definitely moves away from a kind of tick box exercise, from just taking their point of view in general, which is what you've written in the question, to really thinking about how you're going to use it and involving people in the process, potentially as peer researchers, co-designing the intervention as well. But I think it really depends on the problem and the intervention of interest.
Great, thank you very much. That was all the questions I have in the Q&A just now. I ask a final question because there's a couple of minutes left. You showed very nicely this development of the frameworks from 2000, 2008 to now. So it seems to be an incremental step-by-step change in attitudes. And I'm wondering whether that will be enough, or whether we need a sort of paradigm shift or phase transition to actually make change. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I wrestle with that all the time, and have done for the last 15 years now, really, since the obesity foresight diagram came out, which many of you will be familiar with. That was the first, really high-profile use of systems mapping in public health I was aware of. And you look at that and you see, well, yes, that is what the problem is. It is that complex, and there are that many different components and linkages between them. So you see the importance of acting at a whole systems level and using system thinking to understand what's going on. But then you also kind of think, well, what can I do? And you kind of think, maybe I just need to lie down and get up. So I do think our strategy has been to try to increase the extent to which you know, researchers and commissioners and editors are aware of different ways of doing things that might be more effective to tackling some of the wicked issues we've made so little progress on, and also that any specific intervention isn't developed and evaluated almost without thinking about the real world and the stakeholder perspective and what will happen, you know, what the system and context dependence is. So I still feel it's reasonable to take that incremental approach and try and take people with you. I think if you were to try and be a bit more revolutionary and just sort of say we really just need to do everything differently, I think it's going to be very difficult to get people in that place unless you've got really good evidence of where that's been done and it's been really, really useful and effective. And I'm not sure we've got enough examples of that. So if we want a revolution, we need to spend an evidence-based revolution.
Great. Thank you very much to Kathryn and Laurence for a really exciting and inspiring session. And thank you to all the attendees. And see you next time for the next CECAN webinar. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.